Welcome back to another edition of Components Breakdown. Today we're going to take a look at the two-player deduction and bluffing game called Confusion, Espionage and Deception in the Cold War. Confusion is a completely redesigned and themed remake of the classic 1992 strategic abstract game by Robert Abbott that pits two players' mental dexterity against one another in an effort to capture a neutral piece and deliver it across the board to the other player's side through the use of their own individual pawns. The twist comes in the fact that each player does not see the movement capabilities of their own pieces at the start of the game, but are fully aware of their opponent's movement, so players will need to deduce their own movement capabilities throughout the game in order to succeed. Confusion, Espionage, and Deception in the Cold War is being published by Stronghold Games, which happens to be the same company that brought us the wonderfully produced remake of the classic game Survive. With Confusion, Stronghold Games has once again not only produced an incredible set of components that coincide perfectly with the game's deduction style of mechanics, but have also done some retooling of the game's rules and pieces that fit within the context of the new Cold War theme. But before we get into the gameplay, let's first look at the game's components in a little more detail. In front of us we have the starting positions for a standard game of Confusion, and as you can clearly see, it sets up very similar to a game of checkers or chess, with each player's set of spies lined up in an identical pattern across from one another on the game board, with each player sitting in front of the country that they are representing. The game board is broken into a number of different squares in which players' spies will move throughout the game, with each square representing a single point of movement. Each of the player's 13 spy pieces are hollowed out on one side, and are differentiated from one another by a set of unique pictures and letters. The pictures are completely irrelevant to the gameplay, and they're only there to provide a visual element to the game that mostly represent the historical spy equipment of that time period. The letters likewise provide no actual gameplay use, other than denoting which of the 13 player spies they wish to move during their turn, such as moving the X spy or the C spy and so forth. In addition to the 13 color-coded spy markers for each of the two players, there are also 13 unique movement pieces that fit inside of them, each of which represents a different kind of movement that a spy might be capable of taking. Each of these 13 movement pieces are double-sided, one side of which represents a promoted spy that has more advanced movement options available to them, which might once again be considered similar to games like checkers or chess, and the other side which represents one of the 13 different types of allowable movement that the spies start off with at the start of the game. Now, before play begins, players will gather all the pieces of their opponent's color and randomly select a movement piece for each of their spies by placing the movement piece into that cutout area of the spy, making sure that the non-promoted side faces out and can visibly be seen by that player. Once this has been completed for each of the 13 spy pieces, players will then place each of their opponent's spies into the respective starting positions that I previously showed on the game board, making sure that the movement sides of their opponent's spy face the opposing player and not the player who controls them. So in other words, do not allow your opponent to see their own movement pieces for their spies, as this is completely necessary to conceal and plays a major part of the game's mechanics. Players will also place the top secret briefcase in the center of the 11 by 11 board on the appropriately marked square, as once again the objective will be for each of the players to retrieve the briefcase and deliver it safely to the first row of the opposing player's side. Finally, each of the two players will take a player notebook belonging to their specific country, as well as one of the dry erase markers that will be used to track and denote the capabilities of each of their spies as they are discovered through the course of the game. Although confusing at first glance, the notebooks are actually quite easy to comprehend. Each of these notebooks has two parts to them, one of which represents your spies and one of which represents your opponent's spies. Looking briefly at one side of a notebook, you will notice that it is laid out in kind of an XY pattern, showing each of the 13 lettered spy pieces that belong to you, along with the 13 possible types of movement that they may be capable of performing. Through these notebooks, players will deduce and track through trial and error the exact capabilities of each of their spies by marking off those movements that are and are not allowed to be performed, all in a race to reach the briefcase and deliver it to the opponent's side. Now let's move briefly into the gameplay. Confusion is actually a very simple game to play. But its complexity comes not in the mechanics of the game, but in all the strategies and tactics of the gameplay. Again, this comparison makes Confusion very similar to games like checkers and chess, where a real cerebral understanding of your pieces and being able to think multiple turns ahead will almost always trump opponents who are less inclined to think in this manner. Once a starting player is randomly determined, each player in turn order will announce and make a move with just one of their spy pieces. Since each of the two players are completely unaware of the movement capabilities of their own 13 individual spies at the start of the game, players will rely on their opponents to respond with either a yes or no response on whether or not the move in question is in fact a legal move. Now, if the response was a yes by the opponent, then the player may move that spy a number of spaces in accordance to the announced movement value that the player guessed. If the response was a no, then the spy must remain in its current location. Either way, once a player has fulfilled either of these two conditions, the turn will pass to the opposing player, and play will go back and forth in this manner until one player is able to pick up the briefcase in the center of the board and deliver it safely to the first row of the opposing player's side. The trick and truly unique part that makes Confusion such an absorbing game is the fact that once again players are completely unaware of the movement capabilities of each of their own 13 spies at the start of the game. And in order to combat this lack of knowledge, players will keep track of both theirs and their opponent's questions in their own particular notebook, usually by crossing off what their spies cannot be. And as further possibilities are ruled out, players start to deduce the exact movement type of each of their spies for that game. Finding both your spy movement values as well as tracking what your opponent knows about their own spies is incredibly crucial to planning your strategies effectively, because it allows you to not only be aggressive with your path to the briefcase, but it also allows you the flexibility to defend when you have to. Coming back to the gameplay, there are 3 more important features that need mention in a little more detail. First, spies may not move through or jump over other spies, including your own. However, a spy may land on a square containing an enemy spy, in which case that enemy spy is captured and removed from the game, making sure to keep the movement value of the removed spy hidden from your opponent. Second, 4 of the 13 movement pieces are promotable and are designated as such by the crown icon located on their pieces. These 4 spies may be promoted if they reach the opponent's first row, at which time the opponent must announce the promotion by flipping the movement piece to its promoted side. Now, promoted pieces work very similar to any other piece in the game, but they are much more flexible in their movement capabilities, giving the player greater range for the rest of the game or until that promoted piece should happen to be captured. Finally, each player has a movement piece that shows a question mark on its non-promoted side. Now, this particular piece is called the double agent, which is a spy who is secretly working for your opponent against you. The unique aspect of the double agent piece is that your opponent may essentially lie to you about the movement capabilities of the double agent piece by answering yes or no after each movement that his opponent desires. The opponent may in fact declare yes to a move on one turn and then no to the same movement on a later turn. Now, of course, this may not be the most wise of decisions, as that was most assuredly reveal the double agent's identity to that player. But the purpose of the double agent being in the game is that he's there to make your opponent waste his movements on a piece that you may later choose to block, which can essentially be a real game changer in the game if the player was relying on that particular piece for a strategy to pan out. Players do have an option though. Before moving a spy on your turn, you may attempt to eliminate the double agent on your side by declaring that you wish to remove one of your own spy pieces from the game. Now, this is a free action that can take place prior to your normal allotted movement. However, you may not look at the piece that you are removing from your side, and you have to be really careful with this action because you might actually remove a spy of yours that was not the double agent. I will start off this review by stating that Confusion is most definitely not a game for everyone out there, and the reason I believe this statement is true is because I had the opportunity to play the game just over a dozen times now with a wonderful mixture of different types of people that range in age, education level, and even gender, and each person that I've had the opportunity to introduce the game to has had quite the range of reactions to the game. The most common response, though, between all of these playthroughs is that the game is most definitely a thinking person's game and can sometimes feel very much like a brain burner, which just happens to be my type of game. Personally, I am a very analytical person by nature, which is why I have such a fond attachment to deduction style games, and it just happens to be the primary mechanic that drives Confusion. These are the types of games that I thoroughly enjoy playing, and they have the real innate ability to fulfill a mental challenge for me that are harder to replicate in multiplayer games where luck and mostly circumstance play a larger role than true skill. What's really fascinating to me about this game, though, is that although it follows a lot of the traditional formulas and strategies of games like checkers and chess and even Stratego, it's unique enough in its execution to be completely individual of each of those other games. However, as I previously said, Confusion is not for everyone, especially the spatially challenged, and I say that in the most polite of ways. There are a lot of symbols in the game that denote the different types of movement, most notably being the movement towards someone and the movement away from someone. And some people that I've had the opportunity to play with were not able to fully grasp the concepts of visualizing and recording that movement when it comes to their own pieces versus their opponent's pieces, which is such a crucial part of the game. And as comical and outrageous as that may sound, it came up more than once during our games, which made me realize that some people are just better acclimated to a game of this style than others are. However, for me, Confusion is an excellent game that presents an incredible cerebral experience that comes directly from its tense cat and mouse gameplay, and it really kind of harkens back to more of the traditional games in the history of mankind, such as checkers and chess, as I keep referring to. Yet it does this in a completely new and refreshing style of way. And although I think that the wonderfully produced components are probably going to be the biggest draw to a large portion of interested gamers out there, it's really the gameplay that makes this such an alluring and attractive game, and one that definitely should not be missed. It's such a strategic game, it's such a tactical game, and it's really a one-on-one experience that's hard to replicate in anything but a game of this style. So that is Confusion, Espionage and Deception in the Cold War. I am Jeremy Salinas, and thank you very much for watching.